Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, over 4.5 years after the Alberton train derailment and chemical spill, Alberton spill victims finally received a public hearing, which included a startling revelation about the Montana Rail Link derailment. We now begin Part 5, Derailed, with the first 3 chapters. Chapter 1, The Muzzle. The EPA released its blueprint to muzzle the Ombudsman in December 2000. Draft guidelines proclaim the Ombudsman's, quote, independence, impartiality, and confidentiality, and the autonomy to look into any issue or matter consistent with this guidance. A closer look revealed bold restrictions. The guidelines said, in general, the Ombudsman will not investigate an issue or dispute which is in litigation unless with concurrence of EPA administration. Martin's top investigator Hugh Kaufman said this meant virtually all cases. Restrictions went deeper. Before conducting an inquiry that is primarily related to one region, the National Ombudsman will consult with a relevant regional ombudsman. In reviewing Martin's cases, it was unclear whether any would fit into a national ombudsman category. If there was no agreement on who should handle an inquiry, EPA administration would decide. In other words, the National Ombudsman would have no final say on accepting a case. The Ombudsman was required to conduct his or her work without publicity or speculation, and not reveal without consent what he or she learns from individuals. This portended the end of Martin's open process. The muzzle on disclosure included documents. Confidential or privileged documents may not be released without the concurrence of EPA counsel and the program office holding that privilege. As Shattuck in Denver and many other cases had shown, there was no end and often no clear rationale for what dictated a document being deemed, quote, privileged. Public meetings, long the norm for Martin, would be cut out of his control. If the Ombudsman determines that convening a public meeting would benefit an inquiry, he or she must consult with EPA administration. The EPA did not want an Ombudsman hearing regarding a record of decision. Martin had always documented his interviews and public meetings. The guidelines encouraged informal fact-finding and strongly discouraged documentation. The guidelines also sought to muzzle the Ombudsman until his investigation was complete and his report issued, subject to review by administration. Martin commonly recommended further testing be done as part of his investigations. It was clear he would now need approval to even make a recommendation. The guidelines ensured that every moving part of the independent ombudsman had a marionette string attached. Clearly, these guidelines were in reaction to the effectiveness of Robert Martin as the national EPA ombudsman, who had pulled the curtains to let the sun shine on poor practices of the EPA and poor records of decision. Carol Browner's administration wanted a lapdog. With the same end in mind, the incoming EPA administration under Bush II in 2001 would utilize a different approach. Martin had done his work well, revealing how the EPA had often failed to do theirs. The watchdog must be neutered. Concurrent with the release of the draft guidelines, EPA Assistant Director Tim Fields severed Hugh Kaufman from the Ombudsman office. Kaufman claimed he was transferred because Ombudsman case findings embarrassed the EPA and may have cost Al Gore votes in Ohio and Florida. The day after Gore conceded the election to George W. Bush, Fields, a political appointee of Clinton, reassigned a 30-year EPA veteran to other duties in the Office of Solid Waste and Emergency Response. Senator Wayne Allard labeled the move vindictive. Kaufman called this transfer political retaliation for revelations about Gore and the WTI incinerator case in Ohio, but a source in the EPA said that Martin had been out of favor since 1997, when his Times Beach investigation led to a criminal grand jury. One target in that criminal investigation had been the employer of the sister of EPA Director Carol Browner. Martin was not even consulted about the transfer of his chief investigator. At the end of 2000, the Government Accountability Office, GAO, the investigatory arm of Congress, began probing the contentious relationship between the EPA and its ombudsman. In early January 2001, Lucinda Hodges received a devastating dispatch from Martin. In view of reported recent personnel transfers and pending implementation of EPA Ombudsman guidelines, both of which are beyond my control as National Ombudsman, all schedules for all National Ombudsman cases have been put on hold and/or delayed until further notice, he wrote. Left hanging were 20 cases, including Alberton. Martin had been busy. Of the 34 cases he opened since 1992, 18 had started since early 1999, 11 alone in 2000. Shattuck started a snowball rolling, and many cases came at the behest of congressional delegates. Christine Todd Whitman had no sooner assumed control of the EPA under the new Republican administration than in March 2001, public financial disclosures for Whitman revealed her husband John Whitman's financial ties to Citigroup, the banking corporation liable for the Shattuck site. Kaufman thought Whitman had a conflict of interest in deciding the future of the Ombudsman Office. Democrat or Republican, ideologue politics mattered little in the Ombudsman relationship with the EPA. The politics of business mattered. In with the new boss, same as the old. Meanwhile, with the new Congress, Republican Senators Larry Craig and Mike Crapo of Idaho, along with Wayne Allard of Colorado, introduced another bill, Senate Bill 606, to reauthorize the EPA Ombudsman's Office for 10 years and ensure its independence to choose cases. The bill provided for subpoena power through the Inspector General's office, a potential problem, Kaufman said. I am preparing a criminal referral, he said, against EPA's Inspector General for obstruction of justice in 2 other ombudsman cases. The EPA soon announced they would hold back implementing the guidelines pending the release of the upcoming GAO report. Hodges never heard from the beleaguered Martin again after talk of a criminal investigation in the Alberton case evaporated. Hodges said Roger Chalmers hooked Martin up with attorney Ted Lyon on some song and dance, she said, about a criminal investigation. And Ted thought that Bob was delivering the evidence, and Bob thought Ted was delivering the evidence. When Bob found out that they did not have anything to give him and that they were lying to him, he really got upset. And I don't blame him, Hodges said. He said, I'm waiting for evidence. They said they have evidence. They didn't have anything to give Bob. Bob just realized that he had been played, that he had wasted a lot of time. And that was the last I heard from Bob. 5 years into the long haul, there was no word on the thawing of the Alberton case. Chapter 2. Alberton Retested. Epigraph. We begged and pleaded and petitioned and wrote letters and flew all over the country for years requesting this testing. Lucinda Hodges. The EPA prepared to retest Alberton in the summer of 2001. There would be no air testing other than soil gas. There is a risk to the testing, Hopeseek warned. Perhaps nothing will be found and the EPA will say, you're all crazy, now will you stop bothering us? Frank DeRosso of SAGE implied the lack of indoor testing was because I got mixed signals from the hearing. Because Bob Martin never officially requested testing inside homes, it was not addressed in the plan. ACCEH had long requested indoor testing. Following further dialogue with residents, the EPA agreed to test any available samples of the white powder, to look for evidence of buried metal in the excavation area, to test the monitoring wells and some nearby residential wells, and to add additional soil surface samples. The goals were to identify what chemicals released, where they went, what the current concentrations were, and whether they posed a threat to human health. Testing finished in September. Lucinda Hodges told the Missoula Independent, at this point, if nothing comes of it, I don't know what further a community group can do. The EPA and SAGE presented the final results in the Alberton Elementary School in January 2002 to about 25 residents. Of the pit surface samples, 2 had an array of hits, mostly of polyaromatic hydrocarbons, all in low numbers. Olympus's 1996 soil sampling had detected hits for 8 of the same chemicals. Of the phenolic compounds, 2 pit surface samples had hits of 2,4,6-trichlorophenol, the indicator compound used to determine hazardous soil, but below the regulatory level. One of those 2 pit samples also had a hit on 4-chloro-3-methylphenol. Of the 10 surface samples just south of the pit, only one had any hits, with low levels on all 6 phenols tested for, all below regulatory limits. All of these phenols had been found in past tests. The control sample, 580 feet to the east alongside the railroad tracks, also had hits on all the polyaromatic hydrocarbons, though no phenols. Alan Humphrey of the emergency response team thought those chemicals likely came from creosol in rail ties. The subsurface soil samples in the pit found low levels of 2,4,6-trichlorophenol, both from the fill soil and lower native soil in the pit, as well as low levels of other phenols from the native sample. Durasso was surprised to also find low levels of the volatile organic compound chloroform coming from the fill sample. He didn't relate it to the spill, but was at a loss to explain it. In collecting soil gases, Sage only tested for sulfur gases, or mercaptans, from the pit, and none were detected. The EPA emphasized that all these contaminants were well below risk-based concentrations. Of the 20 gas cloud impact soil samples taken off-site, none turned up SVOCs related to the spill. 3 targeted off-site wipe samples had no hits for phenol. 2 had low levels of chloride. In all 5 site samples tested for dioxin-related compounds, Sage found very low hits, including in the control, the highest at 209 parts per trillion taken from native soil from the pit. Durasso said there was no way now to determine whether this dioxin was related to the crestlate. He acknowledged, however, that background studies typically had concentrations of dioxin at much lower levels than in the Alberton tests. As the EPA stated in their START 2 report, because of the multiple potential sources of dioxin released to the environment, it is difficult to know from the data available whether the dioxin levels observed are directly attributable to the derailment. If the EPA had simply tested the crestlate or stained soil in the first place, the issue of a chlorinated crestlate dioxin origin would have been resolved. EPA testing protocol left dioxin results muddled. Monitoring wells, along with 5 private wells, were clear of contaminants. Sage and the ERT did not systematically look for the alleged buried cars, but in the area of excavation, they used metal detectors to make sure sampling drills avoided metal debris. They found only scrap metal. Sage and EPA concluded that based on 1 staging area soil sample and 1 pit sample, the presence of phenolic compounds and 2,4,6-trichlorophenol were probably indicative of residual crestlate and the chlorinated compounds. Concentrations of SVOCs were below EPA risk-based concentrations, however, for ingestion. They wrote, based on the sampling conducted at the site in September 2001, there does not appear to be any significant source of contamination remaining at the derailment site. The EPA said elsewhere, small concentrations of phenols and creosote compounds in soil samples S1 and S11 may remain from the derailment release or may be associated with railroad activities. There would be no further testing. The Missoulian reported that chemical compounds in small amounts at the site were unlikely to be harmful. The Missoula Independent added that residents remained skeptical because of Ombudsman Robert Martin's claims of EPA Director Christine Whitman trying to silence him. It would be wonderful if he could get the politicians off his back and come back and finish off the investigation, Hodges told the Independent. The EPA indicated the issue was finished. Hodges added, I just think it's a terrible shame that they waited this long and didn't come in 6 months afterwards with all the complaints that were happening at the time. The EPA testing, nearly 5.5 years after cleanup, confirmed in part what had already been known, that at the spill site, residual contamination remained, but at levels below regulatory action and deemed at low risk to human health. Though that risk, even from fresh potassium crestlate, had never been particularly well evaluated, especially for people sensitized. But the new testing did not signify the levels of contamination remaining in the weeks, months, and early years after the spill, when people often complain of pesticide-like smells from the site and general area that triggered or aggravated symptoms. By 2001, odor complaints had dwindled, virtually to nothing. Though dioxin was found, the EPA wasn't sure of the source. as in 1996, no white dust was found for testing, but in 2001, its absence for collection was now credible. Whatever contamination remained after the spill had significantly faded after such a long wait for testing in response to complaints. Apart from litigation, the remaining hope for Alberton victims was whether Robert Martin's investigation could somehow address chronic health complaints. But Martin faced an existential crisis. Chapter 3: The EPA Strikes Back. In September 2001, the GAO released its report on the EPA Ombudsman. The title conveyed their accounting. EPA's national and regional ombudsmen do not have sufficient independence. The GAO found that Robert Martin had transformed a sleepy bureaucratic informational kiosk into an investigative ombudsman. The EPA had not welcomed this, seeing problems solved for citizens as problems created for the EPA. The GAO concluded EPA could help ensure that the ombudsman is perceived as independent by locating the function outside the unit he is responsible for investigating, and by giving him control over his budget and staff resources. They noted regional ombudsmen should likewise be truly independent. This was all very different from what the EPA had in mind. EPA Administrator Christine Whitman never responded to Martin's request to meet and discuss the GAO report. In early December, Martin released his interim findings on his Idaho investigations, leveling serious charges against EPA Region 10, including deception of the public, faulty science, building an illegal landfill, and failure to regulate a smelter, among others. Hugh Kaufman said the EPA's Inspector General had yet to open a warranted criminal investigation into Region 10 and Silver Valley. We provided, in fall of 2000, evidence of waste, fraud, and abuse to the IG, Kaufman told media. Martin added that in 1990, the Inspector General wrongly blamed others, rather than the polluter, for the Bunker Hill mess. That IG response was patently false and was either an inadvertent cover-up or far worse, Kaufman charged. In Idaho, Martin's scathing report received ample press, as did Kaufman's comments. On another battlefront that month, in a consent decree, Citigroup announced it would pay towards removal of the Shattuck waste, but only a fraction of the estimated cost. Residents called it a sweetheart deal. Kaufman questioned both the deal and Christine Whitman's husband's financial ties to Citigroup, a top campaign contributor to President Bush. The EPA, the EPA Inspector General, and now Whitman were all under ombudsman scrutiny. Just prior to the release of the Idaho findings and the Citigroup announcement, Whitman made her move, not by implementing the proposed guidelines, but by announcing the transfer of Martin's office from EPA Office of Solid Waste and Emergency Response into the EPA Inspector General's office, effective January 2, 2002. I believe this will give the Ombudsman more independence and the impartiality necessary to conduct credible inquiries, Whitman wrote. Martin told media the Bush administration sought to eradicate his office. He would not have control over his own budget and staff or be allowed to prioritize his investigations. Martin wrote Whitman that the move would, as a practical matter, dissolve the National Ombudsman function at EPA. Martin had criticized IG involvement in Idaho and asserted IG interference elsewhere. Martin's preliminary case report on the Muzzle battery site near Scranton, Pennsylvania, documented that the EPA Office of Inspector General attempted to hinder and obstruct the independent National Ombudsman investigation of the Muzzle case, he wrote. Rob Martin will have no independence, zero, none, Kaufman told the Missoula Independent. Kaufman blamed Whitman's ties to Shattuck. Kaufman said, on November 26, the EPA signed that consent decree that will save Citigroup close to $100 million. On the 27th, Whitman signed the Ombudsman's death notice, so he will not be able to hold hearings on the consent decree. That's the motive. By Christmas, Martin filed a grievance charging Whitman with dissolving his office and forcing the transfer in order to block him from overseeing the pending court settlement between the EPA and Citigroup. Martin said Citigroup would save $30 million to $100 million at taxpayer expense. The grievance marked the first formal salvo that Whitman's family financial ties to Shattuck influenced her decisions. Whitman never formally recused herself from the Shattuck case. By New Year's Eve, Senator Wayne Allard had fully converted to Martin's point of view when he finally heard from the EPA that Martin would have no say over his budget, staff, or cases. Allard would again push for legislation. The war was full on. Whitman's battle with Martin and her ties to Citigroup underwent closer scrutiny when Martin opened an investigation surrounding Ground Zero in New York as to how well the EPA informed the public about hazardous chemicals in the air such as asbestos and fiberglass after the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center. Citigroup owned Travelers Insurance, one of the largest insurance companies handling medical claims associated with the Twin Towers site. In January 2002, U.S. Representative Gerald Nadler of New York asked Martin and Kaufman to investigate. Representative Nadler later testified, "In the 4 months after September 11th to January, the EPA maintained that everything was safe and ultimately remained unresponsive to citizens. In the 4 months from January to May, the time of the ombudsman process, EPA reversed its policy and agreed to initiate remediation inside people's homes. I do not believe it would have happened or happened so quickly without the ombudsman process," Nadler said. But Martin was headed for his own Ground Zero. After judicial delay, one day after the 6th anniversary of the Alberton spill, the Ombudsman Office was handed its Declaration of Dependence as the judge cleared the way for the transfer. Hours after the ruling, Whitman announced Martin's transfer to the EPA's Office of Inspector General would be effective the next day. Due to report to the IGO on April 22nd, Martin never would. Next time on Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment, we conclude Part 5 as Robert Martin resigns as EPA Ombudsman rather than accept the restructuring of his office, which would vastly weaken its function. With Martin no longer on the Alberton case, the EPA Office of Inspector General issues a final report on Alberton. Until then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the 2-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, the true story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.